Death in a quiet suburb. A quiet suburb of Toronto woke up to a typical winter morning in 2022. Everything was covered in a soft layer of snow, creating an illusion of tranquility. No one could have imagined that behind the walls of one of the identical brick houses, a tragedy was unfolding that would forever change the lives of those involved. The investigative team was called to a neat two-story house on the outskirts, where the first signs of the unfolding nightmare appeared against the white snow. A blood-stained kitchen, signs of struggle, and the confusion on the neighbors' faces. This became the starting point of an investigation no one expected to begin on this chilly morning. The body of Mark Taylor, a middle-aged plumber, was found on the kitchen floor. He had been fatally wounded with a kitchen knife. The house belonged to the Higgins family, Sarah and George, an ordinary couple who were considered a model of suburban happiness. However, that image shattered when the police found Sarah in shock, curled up in the corner of the living room. Her eyes revealed fear and despair, as if she had suddenly realized that all her secrets were no longer hers alone. Investigators began their work, examining the house and documenting every detail: footprints on the kitchen floor, torn fabric on the chairs, and the knife left at the crime scene. There had been no attempt to hide the evidence. Everything looked as if the crime had occurred in a moment of rage, spontaneous and unplanned, as a reaction to long-built stress. Sarah Higgins became the focus of the police investigation. Neighbors reported seeing Mark Taylor around the Higgins house more often than usual lately. The plumber, who had initially been called to fix some pipes, had become a frequent visitor, and no one knew the real reason for his visits. As the details were pieced together, a story began to unfold behind the closed doors of this typical suburban home. The affair between Sarah and Mark had started several months ago. It was a classic story. A woman, tired of the monotony of her life, sought something new, and found it in a kind and attentive plumber. George, her husband, worked night shifts, and those long hours of loneliness became fertile ground for the start of a secret romance. It began with short conversations, then dinners, and eventually grew into something much more serious. But all secrets have an expiration date. When George started to suspect that something was wrong, the tension in the house became palpable. Sarah tried to hide her guilt, but each day she noticed her husband's growing suspicion. He stopped leaving her alone at night, started coming home earlier than usual, and watched her actions closely. The situation was escalating, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. The night before the tragedy was especially difficult. George was acting strangely and was unusually quiet. He watched Sarah, and there was something cold and unforgiving in his eyes. She felt that her secret was no longer hidden, but no words were exchanged. The next morning, when Mark came to the house to help with another repair, it became the breaking point. George, losing control of his emotions, took drastic measures. He found Mark in the kitchen, and an argument quickly escalated into a physical confrontation, ending in a horrifying way. Sarah couldn't stop what was happening. Her fear of being exposed paralyzed her, and everything happened too fast. George, acting in a fit of rage, left Mark bleeding on the cold kitchen floor. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the windows rattled. Sarah was left alone with the body of the man who had been her only source of happiness for the past few months. She didn't know what to do. She was shaking, and at that moment, she realized that her life would never be the same. The police questioned neighbors and gathered evidence, trying to piece together a complete picture of the events. All the evidence pointed to the crime not being accidental. 2 glasses were on the kitchen table, one of which was broken. Proof that there had been a conversation before the confrontation. Investigators drew conclusions. There was love, betrayal, jealousy, and cold-blooded retaliation. While Sarah was at the police station, investigators continued examining the house. Every room, every corner was scrutinized to understand what led to such an outcome. In the bedroom, in a dresser drawer, they found a hidden mobile phone containing hundreds of messages between Sarah and Mark, their secret romance documented in detail. These messages became the key evidence, confirming the relationship between the victim and the suspect's wife. Meanwhile, investigators tried to locate George. He had disappeared immediately after the crime, leaving his wife alone with Mark's body. The search was conducted across the city, and his colleagues and friends were questioned. No one knew where he could be, and as hours turned into days, it became evident that George was running, fully aware of the consequences of his actions. His car was found on the edge of the city, abandoned near a forest. There was nothing inside that could help the police in their search, but investigators understood that George was desperate and possibly willing to do anything to escape. Sarah found herself caught between two fires. On one side, the police, who saw her as a possible accomplice, and on the other, her own guilt for being the cause of this horrible crime. She gave her testimony, recounting her relationship with Mark, how it started, and how she tried to hide the truth from her husband. With every word, her voice grew quieter, as if she understood that no explanation could change what had happened. As investigators analyzed every detail, they began to notice that this case was far from straightforward. There were no signs of forced entry, and everything suggested that Mark felt completely at ease in the house. He came in as usual, with a smile and the confidence that he would be welcomed warmly. But instead, he came face to face with his lover's husband, who, losing control, turned their secret affair into a bloody tragedy. This story of love and betrayal, which began with a simple smile and a kind word, ended in death and despair. On the surface, everything seemed clear to the investigators: a jealous husband, a secret affair, and a deadly outcome. But deeper questions remained unanswered. Was it truly a spontaneous act of rage, or had everything been planned? Where was George hiding, and how far was he willing to go to avoid justice? And most importantly, how did Sarah, a woman who once just sought solace, end up at the center of this tragedy, losing everything she held dear? Shadows of suspicion. Sarah sat in the cold interrogation room. Time seemed to have stopped. The metal table, gray walls, and cold stares of the investigators. It all felt like a trap from which there was no escape. She knew that every word she said would be used against her, but she had no choice. All she could do was tell her version, hoping that they would at least try to understand her. However, deep inside, she knew that her life was falling apart, and there was no hope for a normal future. Investigators, working in shifts, began studying every detail and every aspect of the Higgins family's life. Who Sarah spoke with, how she spent her days, when and why she called Mark. They took her phone, checked call logs and messages. Piece by piece, a picture was forming that looked far less straightforward than initially thought. Many questions arose. Why was Mark at Sarah's house so often? Why had none of the neighbors seen George that morning? Why didn't Sarah call the emergency services immediately after it happened? Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Toronto, in an abandoned motel, George Higgins was contemplating his next steps. He didn't know what to do. At night, terrified by what he had done, he fled, leaving everything behind. His mind was filled with thoughts of the life sentence that awaited him. He couldn't go home, and he couldn't contact Sarah. He knew she was now a risk to him, as she could easily turn him over to the police. George was overwhelmed, but at the same time, a plan was beginning to form. He realized that if the police had found his car, they would have already started searching the area. The only way out was to go as far as possible and try to prove that he acted in self-defense. He was surrounded by shadows and fears, but desperation gave him determination. He knew that a long and dangerous road lay ahead, and every action he took would be crucial. At the same time, investigators found a crucial piece of evidence that could change the course of the investigation. In Sarah and George's house, they found a hidden closet that no one had mentioned before. Inside, among old items, was a notebook. Its pages contained carefully written meetings, phone numbers, and even amounts of money. The police began examining the notes and quickly realized these were not just household memos. References to meetings with unknown individuals led the investigators to suspect that other people might be involved, and the crime was far from being a spontaneous act. Moreover, one of the entries led the investigators to a man named Victor, an old friend of George. The investigators decided to locate Victor and question him. They went to his house, hoping he could shed light on George's disappearance. Victor met them with obvious caution. His eyes betrayed hidden tension, and his answers were dry and evasive. Victor claimed that he hadn't seen George for months and knew nothing about him. However, during the conversation, investigators noticed that there was a knife in Victor's kitchen that looked exactly like the one used in Mark's crime. It was a strange coincidence that they could not ignore. Meanwhile, Sarah was under constant police supervision. The psychological pressure was building, and she began to give in. The investigator assigned to work with her noticed that her statements were becoming inconsistent. At one point, she admitted that she had known about George's suspicions for a long time and feared the situation would spiral out of control. She also revealed that Mark had suggested they run away together several times, but she couldn't leave her life and her children, even though she dreamed of it. This statement made the investigators question the motives of all three participants in this tragedy. As the police gathered information, the picture of events became more confusing. Did Sarah and Mark have real plans for the future, or was it just a short-lived affair? Did George know about her plans, and how deeply had his suspicions penetrated their relationship? Each of them had their reasons for their actions, and each was driven by fears, doubts, and mistrust. Sarah didn't know that her conversations with Mark had been recorded. George had installed surveillance in the house weeks ago when he first suspected something was wrong. This discovery was a real shock to her when investigators presented the audio recordings as evidence. Meanwhile, Victor, despite his initial caution, was growing increasingly nervous. He knew more than he was willing to tell the police. He had to make a difficult decision: remain loyal to his friend or try to save himself. In the end, he decided to call George and warn him that the police were interested in him. It was risky, but Victor couldn't allow himself to be dragged deeper into this mess. He didn't know that his phone was already being monitored, and the investigators immediately acted on the call. George understood that time was running out. His hideout was no longer safe, and every second he stayed there brought him closer to capture. He decided to leave the motel and go deeper into the woods, hoping to hide for at least a while until he could find another way out. He knew that the police were already on his trail, but he wasn't going to give up without a fight. He was now the prime suspect in Mark's crime, and his every action was aimed at evading justice. Meanwhile, Sarah felt her life was crumbling. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every morning began with interrogations and questions to which she had no answers. She was forced to recount everything in minute detail, returning to the specifics of her relationship with Mark. The psychological pressure was taking its toll. Sarah increasingly felt cornered. She knew George was hiding somewhere, and every time she was asked about his whereabouts, she was overcome with panic. She feared for her life as well as George's. But most of all, she was tormented by the guilt of knowing that it all started because of her. Investigators tried to piece together all the fragments of the puzzle, but every time they seemed close to a breakthrough, new information emerged, complicating everything. They discovered that in Sarah's notes, there was mention of a certain contact, a person she met secretly. His name was encrypted, and it took several days to track him down. Soon it was revealed that this person had direct ties to George's work. This discovery marked a new turning point in the investigation. They now understood that George might not have acted alone, and the entire story could be far more complex and layered than they had assumed. Sarah began to realize that her secrets, as well as George's, were starting to surface. She could no longer trust anyone. She knew that the police were not only investigating Mark's death, but were also trying to determine how deeply she herself was involved. She felt her environment closing in on her, and the time she had to find a way out of the situation was quickly running out. Meanwhile, investigators continued to monitor Victor. His nerves were failing, and he made several mistakes that allowed the police to establish his connection with George. Surveillance of him led them to a new lead, an unknown person who met with Victor on the outskirts of the city. This meeting confirmed their suspicions. George had help, and this help could be the key to unraveling the entire story. George, hiding in the woods, knew that time was running out. He felt fear closing in on him, but he wasn't going to give up. He knew that all he had left was his willpower and desperation. He began planning his next move, understanding that he had to find a way to contact someone who could help him leave the country. But who would be willing to take such a risk for him? George realized that his life was now in the hands of others, and that made him even more vulnerable. At the Toronto police headquarters, the tension was growing. Each new discovery led to even more questions, and the investigation became increasingly convoluted. The investigators knew that time was working against them, especially with the main suspect, George Higgins, still at large. But they didn't give up. The case had taken on a personal dimension, and each of them wanted to see justice done. The first significant breakthrough came with the discovery of Victor's new whereabouts. After monitoring him, investigators found out that he regularly visited a warehouse on the edge of town. In that warehouse, they discovered a locked room, which by all indications had been used as a temporary hideout for George. Traces of his stay were found there, personal belongings left in haste, a blanket, and several scraps of paper with notes. One of these scraps contained a phone number that wasn't in any of the police databases. This phone number became the new key lead. Within a few hours of investigative work, they managed to track down the person to whom the number belonged. It was a man named Larry Sanders, a little-known local businessman involved in some shady dealings. Larry owned a small transportation company, and it turned out that his services were often used to cover illegal operations. However, Larry's connection to George remained unclear. Investigators understood that this person could be a middleman, someone helping George hide, but they still lacked concrete evidence. Meanwhile, Sarah, who was under constant police surveillance, was becoming more and more overwhelmed. Her nights were full of nightmares, and her days filled with endless interrogations. Investigators kept coming back to her story, and each time she felt her answers crumbling like a house of cards. At one point, she even felt a sense of relief when she was moved to a separate room, away from other suspects and witnesses. In this room, she could at least be alone for a moment, without pressure or questions. The psychologist working with Sarah tried to help her open up. He knew that the keys to solving this tragedy lay within her. And one day, during another session, Sarah unexpectedly admitted that she had met Larry several times. At first, these were ordinary meetings where they discussed issues related to George's business. Larry offered to help arrange transportation for George's company. But over time, the conversations became more personal, and Sarah realized that Larry knew too much about her life. He knew about Mark, knew about the problems with George, and even offered his help in solving those problems. Sarah felt that Larry was using her to get to George and learn about his affairs. She couldn't understand why he was so interested in her husband, but she knew that money was involved. One day, Larry said that George had debts, and he could help cover them if George agreed to certain conditions. Sarah didn't know what those conditions were, but after that conversation, George became more anxious, often disappearing at night, and eventually installed surveillance equipment in the house. In the meantime, investigators put Larry under surveillance. His actions left no doubt. He knew more than he was willing to admit. For several days, he behaved suspiciously, frequently changing his routes and avoiding meetings with colleagues. One night, when Larry went to the abandoned warehouse, investigators knew it was time to act. They apprehended him right on the spot, and under pressure from the evidence, Larry agreed to testify. From his account, it turned out that George had indeed taken money from Larry, and that money was part of a larger operation involving illegal activities. Larry tried to force George to participate in transporting restricted goods, using his business as a cover. When George realized he was caught in a dangerous game, he tried to get out, but it was already too late. Larry knew all of George's weak spots, and one of them was his family. Threats became part of their communication, and George understood that if he didn't comply, not only he but also Sarah could suffer. Sarah, learning about Larry's testimony, was stunned. She had no idea that her husband had been involved in criminal activities, but now everything made sense. She understood why George had become so suspicious, why he was watching her and Mark. He believed that the only way to protect his family was to control everything around him. But that control led to catastrophe. The investigators, armed with Larry's testimony, began to understand that this case went beyond a simple family drama. It was a story of debts, manipulation, and fear. George had become a pawn in a game he couldn't control, and his desperate attempts to escape it had led to tragic consequences. But the main question remained: where was George now, and what were his intentions? The police began combing every possible place where George could be hiding. They knew he was desperate and willing to do anything to avoid arrest. However, his trail was lost in the woods, and despite the use of dogs and helicopters, they couldn't find him. At some point, The investigators started to believe that George might have found refuge with someone willing to risk everything for him. But who could be so loyal to him? The answer came unexpectedly. Victor, who was under constant surveillance, received a strange letter. It was handwritten and had no return address. The letter spoke of a meeting at a designated place, and the text was clearly encoded, understandable only to two people, Victor and George. The investigators decided to let Victor follow the instructions and began preparing an operation to apprehend George. The night came when Victor set out for the meeting. He was visibly nervous, and the investigators watching him knew that things could go off script. Victor drove up to an old barn on the outskirts of the city, and after getting out of the car, looked around. There was complete silence, only the sound of the wind disturbing the eerie stillness of the place. He went inside, and the investigators began surrounding the building, preparing for the takedown. Inside the barn was George. He looked exhausted and desperate. Victor tried to persuade him to surrender, but George knew he had no way out. He knew it was all over, and that his life now belonged to the justice system. He took out a gun that he had with him and pointed it at Victor, demanding that he leave and let him be alone. Victor pleaded with him not to do anything foolish, but George was resolute. At that moment, the investigators stormed the barn. Everything happened too quickly. Shouting, commands, the sound of a gunshot. When the dust settled, it became clear that George was on the floor, wounded but alive. He had attempted to end his own life, but the investigators managed to stop him. He was taken into custody and immediately transported to the hospital. That night marked the end of one chapter in this tangled case. George had been captured, but questions remained. Why had he chosen this path? What had driven him to make decisions that led to Mark's death and the destruction of his family? The investigators knew that there was still a long process ahead, but now, at least they could get answers directly from George. Sarah, upon learning of her husband's capture, felt mixed emotions. It was a relief but also fear for his future. She knew that he would face trial and likely spend many years in prison. But she also understood that she could finally tell the truth, share her story, and perhaps start anew, even if that life would be nothing like the one she had imagined. The conclusion. The awakening from despair became inevitable for all participants in this tragedy. George had been detained, and now all that remained was to wait for the trial, which would finally put an end to the questions tormenting each of them. The wait for the trial turned into an unending torment, but at the same time, it brought a sense of closure. At least they knew that there would be an ending, whatever it might be. The trial began several months after George's arrest. The courthouse in downtown Toronto became the arena where all the lines of this complicated story crossed. On one side was Sarah, psychologically exhausted but determined to fight for the truth. And on the other was George, now admitting his mistakes but still wanting to protect his family as much as possible. The public followed the case with interest, and journalists sensationalized the details, making the story headline news. The prosecution presented their case, using the vast amount of evidence gathered during the investigation. There were Larry's statements, Victor's testimony, and the audio recordings found in George and Sarah's home. The prosecutors painted George as someone who, finding himself in a difficult situation, chose the path of aggression and became a threat to everyone around him. They emphasized his intent to harm Mark, and the fact that he had planned his hideout and escape, fully aware of the seriousness of his actions. George's defense, in turn, focused on his motives. The defense attorneys tried to show that George had acted under extreme emotional stress and despair, caused not only by Sarah and Mark's affair, but also by the pressure Larry put on him. They argued that George had been cornered, and his attempts to leave the criminal business had failed due to Larry's threats. George himself testified, admitting his mistakes and describing how his life had gradually turned into a nightmare, how he had tried to find a way out, but each step he took only made things worse. One of the key moments of the trial was Sarah's testimony. Despite being under immense stress, she decided to take the stand. She spoke about how her relationship with Mark had started from a simple desire to feel alive and needed again. How loneliness and fear of George pushed her to take that step. But according to her, she never imagined that their affair would lead to such a catastrophe. She also confirmed that George had indeed been under significant pressure from Larry. that his behavior had drastically changed after their meetings, and that he began acting as if everything around him was a threat. When Larry took the witness stand, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Larry tried to appear calm, but under the pressure of the prosecutors and George's attorney's questions, his composure began to crack. He admitted that he had indeed pressured George, forcing him to participate in illegal dealings. However, Larry vehemently denied his role in escalating the conflict, claiming that he had no intention of causing harm to George or his family. This statement provoked outrage among those present, especially Sarah, who knew that his words were far from the truth. The trial lasted several weeks. The jury carefully listened to both sides' testimonies, studied the evidence, and reviewed witness accounts. They had to determine whether Mark's death was the result of premeditated action, or if George acted in a fit of passion, trying to protect his family from a threat that seemed real to him. The prosecutors demanded the maximum punishment, accusing George of intentional harm and attempting to evade justice. The defense attorneys, on the other hand, asked for leniency, considering the circumstances. When the time came for the verdict, the courtroom held its breath. The jury foreman stood up and read the verdict. George Higgins was found guilty of second-degree manslaughter. The judge, considering all the circumstances of the case, including the pressure exerted on George and his attempt at self-harm, sentenced him to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. The verdict elicited mixed reactions. Some thought it was too lenient, while others found it fair given all the circumstances. Upon hearing the verdict, Sarah felt mixed emotions. On one hand, it pained her to know that her husband would spend many years in prison. But on the other hand, she realized that at least now she could start anew. She knew she had to fight for her own life and the lives of her children, to try to forget everything that had happened and build a new reality, free from fear and lies. She also decided to cut all ties with Larry and everyone connected to this nightmare, to protect her family from any possible repercussions. After the trial concluded, journalists surrounded Sarah, asking questions about her feelings and future plans. She refused to comment, leaving the courthouse accompanied by her lawyer. Her face was pale, but determined. She knew that a long road to recovery lay ahead, but now she had a purpose: to protect her children and give them a better life than the one they might have had if all of this had continued. George was transferred to a correctional facility where he began serving his sentence. The first days in prison were tough. The loneliness and thoughts of the life he had lost tormented him. But gradually, he began to accept his fate. He knew that everything that had happened was the result of his own decisions and mistakes. He realized that he had tried to protect his family, but in the end, he had destroyed it. The only thing he could hope for was that one day his children would understand him and perhaps forgive him. Victor, who had also been called to testify, decided to leave the city after the trial ended. He knew that his connection to George and his involvement in this story had made him the subject of police and media attention. He wanted to start fresh, to leave everything behind. However, the guilt of not being able to stop his friend haunted him, and he knew he would have to live with it for the rest of his life. Larry, despite his attempts to avoid punishment, also faced consequences. The prosecution began investigating his activities, and soon he was charged with organizing illegal shipments and extortion. His arrest became another part of the conclusion of this complicated story, and he knew he couldn't escape justice. Larry, who once thought of himself as untouchable, now found himself in the position of those he had manipulated. The story of George, Sarah, and Mark became a tragic reminder of how easily someone can be drawn into a chain of events that spiral out of control. It was a story of love, betrayal, fear, and despair that led to the destruction of several lives. George tried to protect his family, but his methods led to tragedy. Sarah sought comfort, but ended up losing everything she held dear. Mark became a victim of circumstances, caught in the middle of a conflict that could not end well. The trial and the verdict put an end to the case, but life continued for everyone involved. Sarah decided to leave Toronto to start a new chapter in her life somewhere where no one knew her past. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to fight. George began his path to redemption in prison, hoping that one day he could see his children and explain his actions to them. Victor and Larry also had to face the consequences of their actions, each in their own way. This story left many questions unanswered. Could George have acted differently? Could Sarah have prevented the tragedy if she hadn't hidden her feelings? Could Mark have walked away when he realized the affair was becoming dangerous? The answers to these questions will remain unknown, but one thing was clear. They all became victims of their own fears and weaknesses. And although the court rendered its verdict, the real reckoning for each of them was in what they had lost: family, love, freedom. With the end of the trial, the story didn't conclude. It continued in the lives of those involved. And while the case was closed in the eyes of the law, for all participants in this tragedy, the wounds remained, and they would take a long time to heal. But now they had a chance to start over, with a clean slate, having learned from the mistakes they had made, and with hope that the future would be better than the past.